My project is the Colonial History of the Australian Mammals in Cambridge, and it's a Headley Fellowship project supported by the Art Fund. And what I'm trying to do is understand what networks are involved in getting the huge amount of Australian mammals we have here, so kangaroos, koalas, wallabies, wombats, platypuses and echidnas. Who is involved in collecting them and how did they get here? And that's really about thinking that although they were donated by most likely a white man, who was really behind that collecting, and what can we tell about Indigenous and local collectors that were perhaps involved in their collecting, but also being more honest about the troubling colonial history. My project links with the Society and Identity theme from CCC. My corner of zoology is Australian mammals, and I'm interested in their ecology, but also how the world came to know them. The idea, I suppose, came really crystallised when I was looking at some skins of a marsupial mole that we have in the collection. And they're down as being collected by someone called Edward Sterling, who is a white man. It's obvious to me, I think. It's really clear that it's impossible that Edward Sterling could have collected these specimens, that he could have known that a subterranean tiny mammal was out there, and it must have involved some Indigenous collectors who have not been credited in that scientific history. So to go from there, I thought, well, we've got about 400 mammals here, who are collected by about 30 different people, and to take the opportunity to see what other stories are behind there, what else can we dig out. So a lot of people might think of natural history museums as kind of places of science, of a very, very apolitical kind of just tell the facts. But of course that's not really how science works, because science is part of society and people have chosen which facts to choose, which specimens to collect. And if you go to any natural history museum with an international collection, you're very likely to see a very strong bias from where in the world they come from. So one way that colonialism is represented in museums is just the geographic biases. So in the UK, we're likely to have mountains of specimens from Australia, from India, from certain parts of Africa, certain parts of South America. We're very unlikely to have specimens from Russia or China or even France. And that's all down to the imperial history of the relationship between Britain and the rest of the world. That's not the only way that colonialism is represented. It's more in thinking about colonialism as this extractive process where people have travelled to another part of the world, taken stuff in natural history museums, that's animal, vegetable, mineral, in our case animal, what can the imperial centre gain from that? And museums are very much a product of that question. We are the repositories of that material wealth of other countries. One thing to bear in mind when you're looking at natural history collections, we often say something like, oh, this was collected by Darwin, or this was collected by Wallace, or some other huge name. And it's really important to remember that those people didn't work alone. And it is very common to not see any other names associated with that. So for example, in Wallace's case, so Alfred Russel Wallace, one of the biggest names in the history of science, he co-discovered evolution by natural selection with Darwin, founded entire scientific disciplines about how species got to be where they are today. Real scientific giant. And we have many of his birds and insects in this collection. He brought back about 129,000 specimens from Southeast Asia on an 8-year voyage and scattered in museums across the world. Some work I did looking at our birds of paradise in Cambridge, I've managed to match the birds here with a 15-year-old Malay teenager called Ali, and some others by another teenager called Badaroon, who were research assistants or field assistants on Wallace's collection. And Wallace gives them a lot of credit in what he writes about, and that Ali made huge contributions to understanding the natural history of birds of the Malay archipelago. But we don't see those stories well represented in museums, and that's something I'm trying to look at. The reason I think it's important is that if we want to be relevant parts of society, we have to reflect the societies that we're in. And if we're only representing a certain slice of society, then a lot of other people might not feel so welcome here. But if we can say, in the case of a 15-year-old Southeast Asian boy collected this, and that was the first time this was seen by Western science, then more people might feel represented in collections, and I think that's incredibly important. So I'm trying to do two things that I think are really important, one of which is just to be honest about the stories that have brought this collection together in ways that haven't necessarily been told out loud before, and also just to celebrate a greater diversity of people who've contributed to the history of this museum, to the history of science, and then the history of society as a whole. So I'm just getting started on the project now, and I've already found some really interesting stories about the people who've added to our collections. I'm really looking forward to what happens next of the big parts of the collection. I've started small. I'm going to look at the big collectors and see what I can unravel about them.